So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first live insight session for the summer series. So this afternoon, my job is to go through all of my analysis of the performance data, particular questions that either I found interesting or we've heard teachers find interesting or students found interesting. So we'll have a dive into particular questions where we think that's of interest. So let me share the agenda with you. Here we are. So we're going to have a look at some entry data. So you can see the figures on how many students sat their GCSE Maths at Post-16 this summer and which boards of choice they are sitting with. We'll go through a quick reminder of those 28 key topics that we identified a few years ago through our Post-16 research. So you'll see those flag up through this session. And then we'll take a look at the crossover questions. This session, I will only focus on the performance of those crossover questions at a foundation tier level, because for Post-16, the benchmark is, of course, getting those students the grade 4. So I won't be doing any analysis from the foundation to the higher tier. If you would like that analysis and that data, then please do join me next Tuesday for the main GCSE cohort event for the summer series. That will be available in the main review session. So for this session, we will look at the foundation tier only. And after those crossover questions, we'll look at the first 5, which we like to call the 1 markers. So we'll look at those first 5 questions that get our students off to a really successful start on each of those papers. And then, like I said, we will dig into the winners and the progress topics. So I don't like to call them losers, but the questions that our students did really well on and topics that I've picked out that I think we could have a bit more practice and inform your interventions and planning for the year ahead. Or for November, because that's just around the corner. We'll look at some keynotes from those examiner reports and the conversations that we've had with examiners since the marking and the summer outcomes. And then I'll highlight some data in terms of the boundaries and the proportions of gradings that were issued, along with how many that feeds into in terms for an FE context, so you can see those figures as well. And then we'll wrap up with signposting you to where you can find all of the support that's available to make this year ahead be the most successful yet. So with that in mind, let's have a look at our first item on the agenda. So looking at entry data for this summer, there were just under 200,000 students that sat their GCSE Post-16 students. This is, remember, so just under 200,000. We saw a massive increase there, didn't we? I think it was 19.6% increase in the Post-16 market. So a huge surge for students resitting their maths this summer. You can see that I've broken that down to the Edexcel for us. So we have just over 51% of students sit their GCSE with us, and then, of course, the other awarding organisations, so about 28.5% sit with AQA. And the others, I've put the little note there, of course, with Educas and OCR. They don't publish their data publicly on their grade statistic documents. So that's just a calculation of the remaining students. So we can't dig into the Post-16 numbers specifically for each of those boards. Hopefully they'll release that at some point. If we keep asking them, we might be able to get that data at some point, but that's kind of they both together make up the remaining 20%. So I mentioned those key topics. So here are the 28 topics. You'll see this little logo in the top right-hand corner where we identify where a question comes under this umbrella. So for those of you that are not sure what this key topic work is, we did the research kind of 3 or 4 years ago on what we wanted to know, what Post-16 teachers delivered as their main key topics without having to worry about things like Pythagoras. You won't see Pythagoras on there, or the exact trig values. Teachers were telling us, no, we don't touch those. We don't worry about delivering that. There's a kind of key section that we focus on. So through that research, these 28 topics came out. On the downloads, you can access this in the Emporium. The link, the hyperlink there is active, so you can click on the image or the hyperlink at the top there to take you to the website. And we'll talk about, you can see a reference there to our FE online diagnostic assessment, and we'll talk a bit about that at the end of the session. But I just wanted to highlight where you'll see this logo. It's one of those key topics that FE teachers focus on predominantly. Okay, so as promised, let's get going into the crossover questions. So there's usually about 25, 26 marks where this happens. So on papers 1F and 1H, there were 26 marks available. And for the foundation tier, they were questions 20 to 26. So I've highlighted in pink the mean percentage performance of those questions. We expect the performance percentage to be lower at the end. Obviously, students start to find those questions more challenging. So as you can see there, question 25 was not very successful for our post-16 students, with 3% and 2% success rate on the equations of lines. But I know I can hear a lot of you thinking, I don't teach my grade 3 to grade 4 students about equations of lines. It's just too much. It's too difficult a concept for them. We focus on the others. So you know, some of the data you can look at and dig into the reasons, and you ask yourself those questions. Why is that question so poorly answered? And we can infer our own judgments. So I've highlighted the green band there at grade 4. So they are the average scores for a grade 4 student. And what I like to do each year, and I know other teachers post-16 and pre-16 have said they like to have a look at the average score difference between a grade 3 and a grade 4, and where you can see that significant jump, it's a good grade 4 indicator. You know, what really does separate a grade 3 student out from a grade 4. For example, I can see question 24A being 1.29 for a grade 3 and then 1.68. There's quite a big jump between the two. The area of composite shapes was a huge indicator for a grade 4 student, and again at grade 5. So grade 3 students were averaging 0.89 out of 4 marks, whereas the grade 4 student was getting nearly 2 of those marks. There's a real big jump in the ability between those two. So focusing on what that drills down to is with your grade 3 students, if you want to try and help them get across that line, let's focus on some composite areas, for example. And again, you can see the huge jump between a grade 4 and a grade 5. So with paper 2, we again had 25 marks from questions 20 to 26. So I've highlighted again, this is quite interesting. Oh, by the way, this data is available on the Emporium in the skills maps. So I've just done a little bit of playing around with the data to do my analysis, but and of course you can download those maps and have a play with the data and whatever you feel is going to help your students. The second tab on the bottom of there is your post-16 data only, and the first tab is for the entire cohort. So here we can see, again, a nice shift between the grade 3 students and grade 4 students. Of course, it goes right down to the students that were unclassified, and you can see the jump between the two. And again, we can see that the final crossover question there about algebraic expressions, or, you know, representing a scenario algebraically, is not a strong topic for our foundation tier students at post-16. It's also worth pointing out at this point about the tier equating algorithm that Ofqual has in place. So because we have these common questions across the tiers, the test equating will be used by every exam board to ensure that comparability between the two tiers. For reference, if you want to look that up, it's called the chained equipercentile equating algorithm. Bit of a mouthful, but this calculation uses the performance on these common items, and it generates equated pairs of marks, so it can represent the same standard across each tier. So in a nutshell, basically what that ensures is that a grade 5 student, for example, on the foundation tier, should perform equally to a grade 5 student on the higher tier. So there's that equitable outcome of those questions. But if you Google that on Ofqual, there's a lot of data on there. You can have a look at examples of how they apply that. And there's also some nice presentations on it as well. So if you wanted to take that back to your teams and share that. But it's worth mentioning how those pieces of data are comparable across the 2 tiers. Okay, so let's look at paper 3 then. So 25 marks here for paper 3, and we can see again I'm going to pick out plans and elevations in the main insight session for GCSE Maths, because it was a really interesting question that they asked, quite unfamiliar. Rather than drawing their own plans or elevations, they were asked to infer someone else's. It's quite an interesting outcome. So some of these questions I've picked out, but the compound units, when I looked at question 26 in more detail, I could understand why that question wasn't so greatly answered by our post-16 students. It was quite word heavy. It was around density, which is quite unfamiliar. So again, you can make your own inferences as to why you think these statistics can be poor for some and high for others. Look at standard form. That's such a refreshing outcome, especially at post-16. We heard a lot in the beginning of the specification when we started assessing in 2017. Straight off the bat for the first cohort, standard form was quite it was alien to people because it was new content, not only new content, but quite a difficult aspect to get their heads around. But it's nice to see these outcomes creeping up as they're tested and become more familiar. Okay, so I'm going to pick out several questions across those papers that I thought we'd have a dig into a little bit. So the first one I want to talk about is question 26 on paper 1. And it is about the JARS. Now, I'm not sure how much you pay attention to social media on exam days. I sit and read all of the platforms as these exams are taking place to see what the responses are from students and teachers. So this question kind of blew up a little bit on social media, with students not too happy really with the jars and context that they were thinking about. Why do people need empty jars? But there we are. They also questioned why someone would need 400 empty jars, but they're quite entertaining on the day to see their social remarks. So for our students, this average mark, as you can see in the bottom right there, students were scoring an average of 0.56 out of a total 5 available, which equates to an 11% success rate. There are clear defined outcomes. So if we go back to that skills map, you can do this in your own time. I won't, hang on too much about it. But if you look at this question 26 across the bottom, you can see a real clear defined difference in the grade, the demographic at each grade. We've gone from 0.69 for a grade 3 student to an average of 1.27 for a grade 4 student. So when working with your grade 3, 4 borderline students, really digging into that real life context of ratio applications is going to be where the focus needs to be. And I think as a team at the Maths Emporium, we need to put together some new resources that will help you do that. So students can be practicing what they need to practice. So let's get back to that question, because I want to talk to you about where the pitfalls were. The most common mark awarded was that first mathematical line, if you like, the 3/8 of the 400. So that was the most commonly awarded mark. But in order to make further progress, students needed to be able to associate those corresponding parts from the 2 ratios given. Now, I know that these types of questions have become more commonly seen and students are becoming more familiar, but I think that was the blocker for the majority. However, where candidates did find that there were 30 empty small jars, there was a majority that went on to then incorrectly calculate the proportion, and they were then saying it was out of 150 and not out of the total 400, which gave them that that final missing mark at the end. So they're the pitfalls for that ratio question. Just off the back of that, I wanted to pick up question 25 on paper 2 as well, because it was another using ratio in real life context, but then throwing in some fractions and percentages, just to be mean, as they said on Twitter. But the average mark for this question was slightly higher. I mean, not brilliantly higher, but students were able to score more marks. We had an 18% success rate on this question. And we saw an average of 0.87 to 1.71 between the grade 3 and the grade 4 students. So again, there's that differentiator where grade 3 students, if they really are working on their ratio work in real life contexts, that should help get them over the line into that grade 4. The examiners commented that very few students showed that methodical step-by-step working out, and by having unorganized working led to a lot of arithmetic errors. We hear that most years about the logical approach to questions like this, wordy questions. So their recommendation as examiners are to centres making sure that there's opportunities for more practice on multi-step questions and how to logically organise their work. So the third question I want to pick out from the crossover questions was from paper 3 in question 27. Historically, we've always been pretty good at tree diagrams. In June 2019, we saw a success rate of 62%. In November 22, we saw 72%. And what drew my attention to the outcome this year is we've slumped down to 52% success rate. So something is happening there with the successful outcome. From what I read in the examiner's report, but also from talking to teachers when they've done their access to scripts, it was coin B that was kind of causing a problem for some reason. So I wanted to focus just on the part A of this question, just completing the tree diagram. It looks like a 50-50 question, right? Students were getting one mark or no marks almost. There was very rarely 2 marks awarded. They were able to complete it, but the ones that got 1 mark were struggling with that B branch. So again, I put a link here. You can click on the cabinets when you've got your downloadable resources, either from the Emporium, where the Emporium is the best place to get your resources in the CPD cabinet. You can click on the cabinets and it will take you there, and you can see there's some practice questions on frequency trees and tree diagrams to help students practice those. Okay, the first 5. Now, bizarrely, these are the favourite bit for me at the start of, mocks and practices, because if you've got students that are smashing through those first 5 questions, the rest of the paper should be quite good. It's a nice temperature check as you're marking that first page, but also it's a temperature check for the students as well. They it's giving them the accessible start to each paper. They are quick wins, quick 1 mark in the basket as they're working through these, and they are very familiar. However, there are a couple that shock us every year where I think naturally as teachers we think, gosh, I just thought they would know that, and we haven't covered that. Last year there was a perimeter question of a compound shape. It's like an L shape, so a compound shape on a centimetre grid, and the students had to answer what's the area and what's the perimeter. And I think we were all shocked at the outcome being less than 50%. Less than 50% of our students couldn't answer those questions. And when I asked teachers, they said, I wouldn't even teach it. I just thought because it's something they've been doing since primary school, I thought that wouldn't be a barrier, but there we are. And I'm picking up on that theme because question 3 here, a 23% success rate on question 3. And as you can imagine, they used all of the other angle names, acute and obtuse, but not the reflex. And so that's what let them down. So in terms of summary and looking at the calculations, looking at the mean percentage, in yellow. So the column in yellow is the mean percentage performance for our post-16 students. For your interest and reference, the second column next to that, which is unhighlighted, is the performance outcome for the entire cohort. So you can see just how close the post-16 students' performance is. So when we look at the data as a whole for these 5 questions, these 5 questions were the least successful start to the three papers, but I think that is just because of that question 3 brought that average score down. I wanted to also pick up on question 2, identifying that students are really good at the decimals to percentages. The paper 2 and paper 3 demonstrate a strong success for fractions to decimals and percentages to fractions, but this one was the kind of the challenge for most of them. I mean, 80% is a pretty good outcome, but it was the least successful. So when we do decimals to percentages to fractions, etc., this one was the one they performed least well in, because the others were around 90%. We know that question 3 is the downfall. So it might just be something we've not covered in lessons across the year. Question 4 was really good at 60. I say really good at 63%. We can see the common errors are they were ignoring the place value for example, and just putting, 0.1 would come first because they see the 1 and then the 2 and then the 3 and then it's like they were ignoring the decimal completely. Question 5 as well, we saw a really good outcome at 67%, but the most common mistakes were to just have 32, they just halved it, or we've had cube roots, which is rather interesting, but that was paper 1's first 5, the 1 markers. Paper 2, better. This was the best performing start for all, and sometimes I also think psychologically they're very nervous when they go into paper 1, just a little bit edgy, and they're now they're in their flow by paper 2, so that could have something to do with it as well. But we can see the whole cohort, the average score here was 85% success rate for all 5 questions for post-16, and that is versus 87% for the entire cohort. So almost like for like, a really good start to the questions at the beginning. You can see, this is what we like to see, right? We like to see the outcomes up in the 80s and 90s. Question 2, converting. We had a chat about this in our team earlier today. It's always a conversion that causes problems. And again, that's definitely something we can work on as a team to put resources together to help you with that practice and delivery. But the opening question, great. Students ordering those negatives and positive numbers, getting those in ascending order. As I mentioned with the converting between decimals and fractions, writing a fraction as a decimal was answered by the majority of the cohort, but a large proportion of them wrote their answer as a percentage, and also with the wrong magnitude if they put it as a decimal, was the error. Question 4, relatively okay, 87% success rate there. The issues that we saw were just numbers that weren't multiples of 7 or weren't within the 30 and 40 parameters. And question 5, it's nice to see an algebra question in the first 5 that scores above 80% success rate. They generally were good with that. They could see that we needed a 2 there. And for paper 3, this was a very little difference between post-16 and the entire cohort. I think it was a 76% success rate here. So this was paper 2 was the best start, then paper 3 and paper 1. But again, I think it's down to nerves. 76% success rate for these 5 for post-16 and 79% for the whole cohort. I think when I was looking at what I would have done as a student, I try and put my student hat on and try and empathise with them. I think with number 5, we know that students struggle with ordering fractions, for example, but I wonder, because these are your basic fractions of, you know, a half and a quarter and 2/3, maybe a little diagram would have helped students. We say that to them all the time, don't we? You know, draw yourself a diagram, it might help you. So that was my note I made to myself for question 5 in order to get the performance up on that question. But same errors. Question 1, we saw answers as a decimal or as a fraction in the wrong magnitude. They put it out of 10, for example. We've got another conversion. They seem to like centimeters to meters. I think it's something tangible. They're used to seeing a ruler or a meter stick. So the milliliters and liters is less familiar. Question 3, nice at 84% success rate. Students just maybe making silly errors. They were writing tenths instead of tens. Question 4, we talk about the simplifying algebraic expressions every year. Students just weren't simplifying fully, so we had 8a minus 5a, some students answering 12a, so fully simplifying is key for them to, you know, I think maybe it would help if it said simplify fully. If we added an extra word in there, might give them a nice trigger. Right, let's have a look at my favourites, my winners, and the notes that I've made for some of the questions that I think our post-16 students did really well at this summer, or we're making good progress, and you guys as practitioners are, you know, chipping away at that iceberg and getting them through better than we've seen in previous years. So my first question to pick up on is on paper 1, question 16. So you see that logo in the top corner. Lots of post-16 students focus heavily on money calculations and real life application. So this is a key topic, you know, best value, working with money. It's a common theme, isn't it? Which one's best value? It was a really strong performance for most of our post-16 students. The average score out of the 3 marks was 1.65. Grade 4 students got 2.44. And it was 2.75 for grade 5 students. So nice and close, nothing too differential between them. These types of questions really do show that fundamental mathematical skill base and being able to be set ready for their next stage of life, applications in real life situations. So I think that's why we see post-16 students do well in these. The most common approach was to find the cost of 1 battery for each of the packs, but we saw other students finding, you know, the common multiple there, so packs of 24, etc., and scaling up rather than the unitary method. The problems that we saw, so to try and improve, students got their calculations around the wrong way, so they were doing 12 divided by 6 instead of 6 divided by 12, for example, for the, you know, money on the 3rd pack. And a common mistake was to double the 2nd pack, thinking that would give them 12 and not 16. So again, probably just one of those human error things, and they'd kick themselves if they realised that's what they'd done. But that's another common error that we saw there. So a great question for paper 1. The next one I'd like to pick up on was question 9 for paper 2F. So these are, we've seen these even pre-2015 spec, where students were asked to calculate their electricity bill or read their water meter by using these types of readings. The reason I picked this one up, and I've put the whole skills map data at the bottom there, because I wanted to show how successful this type of question was right from grade 1. And it just goes to show that this familiarity in preparing students for real life context is paying off. So when you have been practicing these questions with the students, even grade 1 students are accessing, you know, they're getting at least 1 mark out of the 4, which is brilliant. So I remember, you know, 15, 20 years ago, looking at data and students really struggling with this. And I remember taking photos of my own meters, they couldn't tell me where their meters were at the house, so I took photos of mine and had them on the screen so they could see them. However, to make sure that we are improving, students struggled. Some of them were reading the digits as individual readings, so single digit distances, and then they were either adding them together. For those that did find the mileage by subtracting and got that final amount of £299 something, they didn't understand the part about expenses, and that's where they missed their final mark at the end. So you know, some real world conversations to have with regards to expenses, but you know, they would have got the 3 marks and not the final one. So the last question I want to pick up on in terms of winners was on paper 3, question 17. Now, I know I picked up a recipe question last year when we talked about our exam insights, but I wanted to show that we are holding steady. 76% success rate for this year, and 78% last year, so almost very comparable. And I think what's happening is, this is again one of the key topics lots of recipe questions focused on. It's working. The identification of these key topics is making an impact. They are significantly better answered at grade 2. So if you are trying to get a student from a 1 up to a 2, these types of questions are going to help them. There was a whole mark difference between the average score from a grade 1 and a grade 2. So I think it was just over 1.1 for a grade 1 and 2.1 for a grade 2. So these types of questions will help those students get out of that grade 1 area. And the most common method was to make 10 shortbread biscuits. They'd divide it by 2 and then they'd scale it up by 3 to get the 30. So that was the most common one. Where there were problems, students were finding 1 biscuit, so dividing by 20 and then multiplying by 30, which caused a few arithmetic errors. So let's look at some topics that we need to work on then. So I picked out the transformation question 19 on paper 1. Students were last asked to describe a translation. So I always like to compare, when did we last ask this type of question and how well did we do it? So that happened in June 2 years ago, 2022, on paper 2F. And we saw an 11% success rate then. We saw a 9% success rate this year. So we are not doing very well with translations. Now, I know that maybe rotations are more familiar for students. They've been rotating for a while. There always seems to be a rotation question as far as I can remember when I did analysis and heat maps. But I wanted to flag this to all of you. And again, it will be a topic that we take within the team to see if there are resources or networks that we can put in place to help beat this, to make these outcomes better. So let me tell you the pitfalls as to why some of the students were not getting the marks. So when they were identifying it was a translation, great, but their vector wasn't correct. They wrote it as a fraction, for example, or the numbers were wrong. They got them round the wrong way. Where the candidates couldn't identify that it was a translation, they were using the wrong terminology. It's shifted, it's moved. We see translocation or transition, so they're nearly there, but not the actual word that will get them the mark. The most common incorrect was to tell us it was a rotation. So when teaching transformations, was heavily reliant on tracing paper. Tracing paper really does help these types of students. But that is something I wanted to draw your attention to. A big push on transformations, I think, will help. The other one I wanted to draw your attention to was on paper 2, question 10. Throwing a coin 3 times or flipping the coin 3 times can land on heads or tails, and they had to do their listing, methodical listing strategy. So this proved actually to be quite a good grade 5 indicator, we saw a significant jump from 0.8 to over 1. We only saw 32% success rate on this question, which is why it gave me, it kind of stuck out to me, because this is a coin that they are familiar with, and it's heads and tails. And I've started to think about where the barriers were. Is it because it was 3 times? I know that the examiners have commented in terms of that layout problem again. So I think students that wrote or they used the abbreviation T and H were more successful than those trying to write it out in full. The layout was a big problem, so they weren't grouping them in an identifiable way. Brackets around a cluster, for example, was more successful than students using a comma. So it may not be that students don't understand the content here or the context it's within. It could have been a layout problem. So it'll be good to see in the exemplars some examples. I might try and find some of those that I can pick up on and share with you in my Twitter feeds, and for example, just to show you the types of examples. But I wanted to bring that up because it's a nice question to reflect with your students and say, hey, I did this training the other day and apparently this question was really poorly answered. Have a go and see if you're better, and see what you find. I think it's quite powerful to do something like that. So the other one I wanted to pick up on in terms of progress was on paper 3. There's a couple on paper 3, but the first one was question 18. And we spoke about rotations just now being the most successful, if you like, of the transformations. We saw a 47% success rate on this on paper 3. And I think it goes down to that heat maps. I think teachers, I did it. I would look at all of the questions that had come up ever. And I saw that rotations came up more often than the other ones for some reason. We don't know why. And I wonder whether that familiarity via mocks, if they've done lots of mock papers and practice papers and rotations are coming up more often than translations, that might be a thing. So I wonder if, as a team, we can put some resources together where there are equal amounts of practice for all of the 4 transformations, so that they've got exposure to all of them in an equal amount. The most common problem here is the center point. Students just rotated the shape, upside down where it was, which of course will get them 1 mark, but using that center of rotation will of course got them the 2nd mark. So that was the key barrier to the success for both marks there. The other one I wanted to pick out on paper 3, if we've got time, I'm just checking time, I might pick up on the 3rd one, was this question 10, and it is a key topic for circle properties. And I know we talk more about the circumference and the area of a circle, but I think it's really important that students, for those reasons, absolutely understand the parts of a circle. Now, 75% of our students could answer part A. They know what a radius is because we talk to them about it all the time when using formulae. But part B, of course, it's not very well known, this one. We saw answers of sectors, chords, diameters, tangents. Obviously, the chord's the right one, but we saw a mixture of all of them. And it was just, I think, again, with the angle at the start of paper 1, they're just throwing out words that they know. And of course, that's what we tell them to do. Even if you're not sure, just put anything down. And I think that's evident that we saw they were just throwing anything down. And again, it's the infamiliarity of seeing the chord. But I just wanted to draw that to your attention about labelling parts of circles. And I wonder how often we do that at Post-16, right? I remember doing labelling circles with students at Key Stage 3 and maybe again at Key Stage 4, but do we do that again at Post-16? So I've just put it there, maybe a nice starter activity for your students. Let's see if I can whistle through one more question, because I think this is the core amount of analysis that we need to go through, really. Question 25, compound interest. And I wanted to hopefully get through this with you because we saw a dip in the performance outcome of compound interest. Now, we saw 25% success rate on this question in comparison to 31% 2 years ago. There was a compound interest question last year, but it wasn't asked in this sort of way. I wanted to find something almost like for like, where we could draw those comparisons to. So we've gone from 31% 2 years ago to 25% this year. And I wanted to dig into why that happened. We are obviously seeing students just calculate the simple interest. So they're getting a mark for finding the 6%, but obviously by timesing that by 3, that's not going to get them the final mark. Some students got the correct answer by doing the repeated, it's almost like a chore, isn't it? Find the 6%, add it on, now get your new figure, find the 6% of that one, add it on. So some students got the correct answer doing that, but not using the hack, if you like, what they would say is a hack of the multiplier with the power of 3. I think we could all probably bet that we know where the problem came from. If they were using a multiplier incorrectly, they were using 1.6, and we did see 1.006 in some places as well. Okay, so that is my whistle-stop tour in kind of 40 minutes of what questions I think were great for our post-16 students, and also the areas that I think we need to pick up on as a team, you guys as practitioners and us as the Maths Emporium team, where we can provide new resources to help you elevate those outcomes. So I wanted to talk about the keynotes that I read from the examiners' reports. Now, I know that they are all available for you to read, but they are very big documents, and you guys, time is precious. So I've done a skim through and taken out what I think are the key pieces of information. Angle facts we've talked about, describing a single transformation. We will make sure that we have some new resources this year on transformations. Solving equations and inequalities always comes up at foundation tier for the whole cohort, but also at post-16. So I think it's the abstract idea of algebra that they really struggle with the boundary. Solving equations and inequalities was something that the examiners picked up on. And we say this as well, don't we, as teachers, until we're blue in the face sometimes, that please check that your answer makes sense before you kind of declare that as your answer. So checking the magnitude or checking that the units are appropriate. We've spoke about simple and compound interest. Again, on the Emporium, those themed papers where I put the picture of those cabinets, go in there, you will find compound interest and simple interest practice. There were a couple of probability questions where students showed that they didn't fully understand that the sum of probabilities can't be bigger than 1. It should be 1. So that was something I found quite key. And also just in terms of admin, there were some angle calculations or other, I think it was that ratio question actually on paper 1, question 26, where students were, not crossing out work or not making it clear to the examiner which response they wanted them to mark. So just making sure that, they're really clear in what they're declaring to their examiner. Let's talk grade boundaries then. So I've done, for comparability, I've just taken this from the grade boundary document on the Emporium. And so you can see the difference between last year and this year. So for a grade 4, there was a slight decrease of 5 marks, so from 147 to 142. And again, we saw that we saw the slight decrease across the board, but obviously we're looking at that grade 4 and grade 5. Some post-16 students want to elevate in November. So it's important so they know what they're working towards. However, what I think is really important to discuss is what that looks like in terms of how many grade 4s are there from last year and this year. You can see that we awarded the same number of grade 4s This is for the whole cohort, by the way. You can see the numbers are rather large, just 523,000 students in total. But on the next slide, I've got that at your centre level. But this just allows you to see what those differences are across the tiers. But here is that data. So you can see there has been an increase in the number of grade 4s that are awarded at FE and sixth form centres. A slight decrease at tertiary colleges, but I think the numbers of tertiary colleges are quite small. So any slight change will have a bigger impact in the statistical data. But FE, we have gone from 13.9% to 14.9% grade 4 and above. And then from 17.5% to 21.8% in sixth form colleges. So a great, well done. More grade 4s in your setting. So that's, we're getting there. We need to make better progress, of course, but we're going in the right direction. So as promised, I wanted to signpost you to everything that we've got available for you right now to help inform your planning and your teaching and interventions. So I keep mentioning the Maths Emporium. If you are not signed up to the Emporium, which is free, please do that today. If that is the one thing you do today, you will thank us. There are over 24,000 free resources on the Emporium for you to access across all of our qualifications, but we've got a dedicated cabinet on there where there are all the Boost resources. You can see the Boost lesson plans talk about boosting that grade using those 28 key topics. So there are lesson plans for each of those key 28 topics with FE contexts. So trying to do something different. There is a scheme of work. There are themed papers for the students to practice on the 28 topics in a post-16 setting. So the questions are, the contexts are motor vehicle, sports science, hair and beauty. So if you're trying to hook those learners in a different way, there are themed papers there. There are key topic papers, and I'm going to talk to you about the 6-week revision program in a second. And the last one I want to mention is the reordered papers. The reordered papers is where we look at that data on the skills map and we just reshuffle them so the questions get ordered in terms of actual difficulty, because sometimes it's not usually the last question that is the most difficult. They muddle up a little bit. So the reordered papers is what that looks like. I did also promise that I would talk about the online diagnostic assessment that I mentioned at the start. So we have created a brand new version that was launched 2 weeks ago. So we have taken, for those of you using our online diagnostic assessment in the original platform, that is now no longer working. We decided to remove all of that sign-up element and just put on free quizzes, slightly different questions. They have got the performance data attached to them as well. So slightly different questions. They're past questions as well, so they're comparable to the GCSE spec, and we know that students have actually sat them. The hyperlink is there, so you can click on that link at the top and it will take you straight to the website. There is a short 2 or 3 minute video that shows you how to use them, so you can download that form yourself and then you can share it with students. We've even made it PDF. So if you don't want to do it via a form, which actually I would, because it does the marking for you, and it gives you a nice little spreadsheet at the end to tell you who's got what right, for example, they are now available as a PDF. So you want to print them out and get students to do those, then please do that, as you can do those as well. But it gives you the idea or the outcomes of how well do my students know those 28 topics, and where do I need to put the intervention in for November if you've got students sitting in November, but of course for June as well. So all the links are there. The other area I want to draw your attention to is where all of those practice papers are. So on the Emporium, you can go into the GCSE cabinet, not just the post-16 one. If you want even more resources, go into the main GCSE cabinet, and there is so many more there. There's a whole list of items there. There are mock sets. There are going to be all of the past papers and examiners reports. Mock set 9 will go into the cabinet in January, which is when we will release mock set 10. So all of the latest mock set 9 is on the website and not in the Emporium at the moment. There are crossover papers. So if you just want your students to practice the questions that we talked about at the start of the session, they are there. We've removed all of the others. There are scaffolding questions, scaffolding question papers, so lots and lots, and shadow papers, which are the live series papers, but we change the numbers because some naughty people leak the papers on YouTube, and then your students get to see the answers. The last thing I want to leave you with is our revision program. So we know that November will be here in no time. And so this is an off-the-shelf package, even with templates, user guides that you can send home to parents and students week by week, what it is they should be doing to revise productively, ready for the next series, whether that be November or whether that be June. It's broken down week by week. There are trackers, and there's also a higher tier if you've got any higher tier students as well. Right. If you want something to listen to on the way home, there's a podcast. I talk to lots of people from all over our sector. There are some fantastic episodes. Please do have a listen. Or if you're off to the gym tonight and want something on the treadmill, have a listen. But the most important thing to give you, other than signing up for the Maths Emporium, is this is how you can get hold of me, or how you can get hold of Vicky Wood, who is your subject advisor. You can book appointments with Vicky if you want to talk to her about anything. You can follow me directly on Twitter. I hear from teachers every day that ask questions, want to find something, etc. So that's how you can get hold of us. So I'm at Miss Maths Geek on Twitter, and Vicky's email is teachingmaths@pearson.com. That is it from us. I will say a huge thank you to all of you. Please make sure you're signed up there to the Development Academy. There are so many more networks coming up. We've got a whole calendar full, which you can see on the Emporium, of all of the networks as well. You will also get an invitation to get your feedback sent over to us about this session or anything else that you feel you needed. And that is all from me for this session. So I want to say a huge thank you. And please do reach out if there's anything else that you need, but that is everything. Thank you.